For more than 3 centuries, the Bank of England stood at the very center of global finance. It was not just a bank, it was a symbol. Known as the Old Lady of Threadneedle Street, it represented permanence in a world of chaos. While empires rose and fell, while wars redrew borders and kings lost their crowns, the pound sterling endured. It was trusted. It was liquid. It was the currency that merchants, governments, and central banks around the world chose to hold when they wanted safety. The British Empire was not built only on red-coated soldiers or ironclad warships. It was built on confidence. And that confidence lived inside the vaults of the Bank of England. Today, when we talk about Britain's decline in the 20th century, we are usually given a simple, almost comforting explanation. We are told that the fall of the pound was inevitable, that 2 world wars drained Britain of its wealth, that the rise of the United States pushed London aside, that Britain simply ran out of money and history moved on. It is a clean story. It is also deeply misleading. Because inevitability is one of history's favorite disguises. It is what we call events after we stop asking who benefited from them. When you look closely at the collapse of the pound, not through headlines or textbooks, but through internal memos, private letters between central bankers, and the quiet decisions made behind closed doors, a very different picture begins to emerge. The pound did not simply fade away. It was cornered, pressured, and, at critical moments, deliberately broken. This was not the result of a single catastrophe or a single bad policy choice. It was the outcome of a repeated pattern, one that unfolded over nearly 100 years. And when you trace that pattern, when you follow the flow of gold, the movements of reserves, and the timing of financial panics, you begin to see something unsettling. You see fingerprints on the weapon. For most of the 20th century, those fingerprints belonged not to a distant enemy, but to Britain's oldest and most intimate rival across the Channel, France. This is not a story about tanks rolling through borders or fleets clashing at sea. This is a story about gold bars stacked in vaults, interest rates set with political intent, and debt turned into a strategic weapon. It is the story of how Paris identified a structural weakness at the heart of the British financial system, and at 3 decisive moments in modern history exploited it with ruthless precision. To understand how this economic war began, we have to go back to the moment when the shooting stopped. But the real battle was only just beginning. When the guns of the First World War finally fell silent, Europe was physically exhausted, but financially, the real conflict was only beginning. Cities lay in ruins. Entire generations had been lost. Governments were drowning in debt. Yet beneath the devastation, there was a powerful desire shared by politicians and bankers alike, a return to normal. And in the language of finance, normal meant one thing above all else: gold, before the war. The gold standard had been the foundation of the international monetary system. Every major currency was convertible into a fixed amount of physical gold. It imposed discipline. It limited government spending. And, most importantly, it created trust across borders. For Britain, returning to gold was not merely an economic decision. It was an act of national restoration. London had been the financial capital of the world before 1914. Sterling was the dominant reserve currency. British banks financed global trade. To abandon gold permanently would have been to admit that the war had broken something fundamental, not just in the economy, but in Britain's identity as a great power. So throughout the early 1920s, British policymakers became obsessed with a single objective: restoring the pound to its former glory. In 1925, that ambition became policy. Under the guidance of Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Britain formally returned to the gold standard. But in doing so, it made a decision that would prove catastrophic. The pound was pegged not at a realistic post-war level, but at its pre-war price, roughly $4.86 to the dollar. It was a number chosen for prestige, not for economic reality. The war had permanently weakened Britain's industrial base. Productivity had fallen. Debt had exploded. Labor costs were higher. Yet sterling was valued as if none of that had happened. The result was a currency that was massively overvalued. British exports became painfully expensive on world markets. Factories struggled to compete. Profits vanished. Unemployment rose. The entire economy was forced to bend itself to defend an artificial exchange rate. The British financial system became something fragile, elegant, admired, but dangerously brittle. A crystal glass. And across the English Channel, France was watching closely. France emerged from the war with a very different mindset. Where Britain sought to reclaim its past status, France was focused on survival and security. The memory of invasion was fresh. The lesson in French eyes was clear. Power depended on reserves, not reputation. Under the leadership of Raymond Poincaré, France stabilized its currency, the franc at a deliberately low level. This made French exports competitive, but more importantly, it allowed France to accumulate vast amounts of foreign currency, especially pounds and US dollars. By the late 1920s, the Bank of France had become a financial black hole, absorbing foreign exchange at an extraordinary rate. But France did not simply hold these currencies. They converted them. Systematically, relentlessly, the Bank of France exchanged its sterling and dollar reserves for physical gold. Crate by crate, bar by bar, gold flowed into French vaults. This was the first phase of what can only be called the sterling trap. Under the rules of the gold standard, surplus countries were expected to cooperate. If a nation accumulated too much gold, it was supposed to loosen monetary conditions, expand credit, allow some inflation so that imbalances would naturally correct. France refused. Instead, it pursued a policy known as sterilization. The gold was locked away, but no new money was allowed to circulate inside the French economy. The metal was hoarded, not shared. This decision had devastating global consequences. By sterilizing gold, France was effectively draining liquidity from the international system. Every bar of gold that entered. Paris was a bar removed from circulation elsewhere, and nowhere was the pressure felt more intensely than in London. Each time France converted sterling into gold, the Bank of England had to physically ship gold across the Channel. The vaults at Threadneedle Street grew lighter by the week. Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, understood exactly what was happening. In private correspondence, he pleaded with his French counterparts to stop, to cooperate, to respect the spirit of the system. The response from Paris was icy. To French officials, gold was not merely money, it was insurance, it was sovereignty, and, increasingly, it was leverage. By 1930, France held nearly 27% of the world's monetary gold, second only to the United States, an astonishing figure for an economy of its size. That gold hoard tightened like a noose around the British economy. To prevent further outflows, Britain was forced to keep interest rates high. Credit became expensive. Investment collapsed. Industries already struggling under an overvalued currency were slowly strangled. Unemployment soared and social unrest spread. The British economy was suffocating, and the oxygen was sitting in French vaults. The breaking point came in 1931. A banking crisis in Austria and Germany triggered a wave of panic across Europe. Investors everywhere rushed to convert paper into gold, and all eyes turned to London. Markets knew the truth. The Bank of England's reserves were dangerously low. If France chose that moment to dump its remaining sterling holdings, the system would collapse. It was a financial standoff, and Britain blinked first. In September 1931, the run on the pound became unstoppable. Gold poured out of the Bank of England at a rate of millions per day. Even the Royal Navy was shaken, as a pay mutiny was gleefully reported by the French press, further eroding confidence. On September 19th, Britain surrendered. The gold standard was suspended. The pound was devalued by roughly 25% almost overnight. It was not just an economic defeat, it was a national humiliation. The era in which the pound was as good as gold was over. France had won the first round, and it had done so without firing a single shot. The rivalry between Britain and France did not end with the collapse of the gold standard in mid-1931. It merely went underground. The Second World War temporarily froze the battlefield. Survival replaced strategy. But when the post-war order finally emerged, the old tensions returned, now embedded inside a new financial architecture. That system was Bretton Woods. Under Bretton Woods, the US dollar became the world's primary reserve currency, backed by gold at a fixed rate. The British pound, once the undisputed king of global finance, was reduced to a junior partner, still important, still widely used, but no longer dominant. For most policymakers in London and Washington, this was a pragmatic compromise. Stability mattered more than pride. But in Paris, one man saw the system very differently: General Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle did not view Bretton Woods as a neutral framework. He saw it as a rigged game, one designed to preserve Anglo-Saxon financial dominance long after their empires had begun to fade. He called it the exorbitant privilege. In his view, the United States and Britain enjoyed a unique advantage. They could issue paper currencies that the rest of the world was forced to hold. Those pieces of paper could then be used to buy real assets, acquire companies, and fund military campaigns abroad, from Korea to Vietnam, while countries like France accumulated claims instead of power. De Gaulle believed that no nation should possess that kind of monetary privilege, and if the system could not be reformed, it would have to be broken. But de Gaulle was also a realist. He understood that directly confronting the United States was dangerous. The dollar was too strong. The American economy was too large. The target had to be the weaker pillar supporting the structure. Once again, that target was Britain. By the mid-1960s, the British economy was visibly fragile. Growth was sluggish. Productivity lagged behind its European peers. Chronic balance of payments deficits forced the government to constantly defend the pound. The exchange rate was fixed at $2.80, a level that increasingly bore little resemblance to economic reality. The Bank of England was locked in a permanent firefight with currency speculators, burning through its reserves to buy pounds on the open market. Britain was not collapsing, but it was vulnerable. De Gaulle noticed. France's strategy in the 1960s differed from the blunt gold hoarding of the interwar period. This time, the weapon was confidence. France began converting its dollar and sterling reserves into gold once again, but now it did so publicly, theatrically. De Gaulle delivered speeches praising gold as the only true store of value. He framed paper currencies as political promises rather than economic realities. At one point, French naval vessels were dispatched to New York to collect gold from the Federal Reserve and transport it back to France. The message was unmistakable. France did not trust Anglo-Saxon money. Markets were watching. But the most effective weapon was not gold, it was information. In 1967, Britain faced a perfect storm. The Six-Day War in the Middle East had closed the Suez Canal, disrupting trade. Dock strikes in London paralyzed exports. The economy was wobbling. At precisely this moment, whispers began to circulate. Sources close to the French Ministry of Finance quietly suggested to journalists that the pound was doomed. That devaluation was inevitable. That France would oppose Britain's entry into the European Economic Community unless the pound was adjusted. These were not official statements. They did not need to be. They were published in influential newspapers. They were repeated by commentators. And every rumor triggered a new wave of selling in the currency markets. The pound was no longer just under economic pressure. It was under psychological attack. The decisive moment came in November 1967. Reports spread that France had withdrawn from the gold pool. A cooperative arrangement among Western central banks designed to stabilize the price of gold. To the markets, this was a signal flare. It suggested that Western unity was fracturing, that France was no longer willing to defend the system. Speculators interpreted it as a green light. The attack on sterling was immediate and overwhelming. The Bank of England spent hundreds of millions of dollars in a single day attempting to hold the line. Reserves evaporated. Each intervention only confirmed how desperate the situation had become. When British Chancellor James Callaghan sought emergency support from European partners, the response from Paris was cool, conditional, and unmistakable. Devalue first, then we can talk. On November 18, 1967, the British government surrendered. The pound was devalued from $2.80 to $2.40. Prime Minister Harold Wilson appeared on television to reassure the public that the pound in your pocket had not lost its value, a statement that became infamous almost instantly. The damage was not merely financial, it was psychological. Britain had been publicly humiliated. De Gaulle had demonstrated that the Anglo-Saxon monetary system could be destabilized, not by force, but by narrative, timing, and pressure. The pound had served as a proxy. The real target was the dollar. And the message to the world was clear. The system was vulnerable. France had won the second round. But the final act of the sterling trap would be even more devastating because this time, Britain would walk willingly into it. By the early 1990s, the world had changed almost beyond recognition. The British Empire was gone. The Cold War was ending. And Europe was racing toward a future built on integration rather than rivalry. On the surface, it looked like a new chapter. In reality, it was the final act of a very old pattern. In 1990, Britain joined the exchange rate mechanism, or ERMA system designed to tie European currencies together within narrow bands. The ERM was meant to impose discipline, reduce volatility, and prepare the continent for an eventual single currency. For Britain, entry into the ERM was sold as a return to seriousness, a commitment to stability, a way to anchor the pound to the strength of Europe's most reliable currency, the German Deutschmark. But from the moment Britain entered the system, the mismatch was obvious. The British economy was sliding into recession. Housing prices were falling. Unemployment was rising. What Britain needed was lower interest rates, cheaper credit to stimulate growth. Germany faced the opposite problem. After reunification, the German economy was booming. Government spending surged. Inflation pressures built rapidly. To contain it, the Bundesbank raised interest rates aggressively. Under the rules of the ERM, Britain had no choice but to follow. The pound was effectively chained to German monetary policy, even though the British economy was in no position to endure it. Interest rates remained painfully high. Mortgage holders were crushed. Businesses failed. The economy bled. 'Twas not stability. It was slow-motion torture. And yet, leaving the ERM was politically unthinkable. To exit would mean admitting failure. It would shatter Britain's credibility. And it would call into question the entire European project. This is where France re-entered the story. Under President François Mitterrand, France had become the political engine behind European monetary integration. The ERM was not just an economic mechanism, it was a stepping stone toward the euro, a project France viewed as essential to binding Germany permanently into Europe. For Paris, the ERM had to be defended at all costs. As cracks began to appear in the system in 1992, it was French political pressure that prevented an early adjustment. Realignment was delayed. Doubts were dismissed. Publicly, unity was proclaimed. Privately, the markets were watching. The trigger came not from London or Berlin, but from Paris. France scheduled a national referendum on the Maastricht Treaty, the agreement that would formally create the European Union and set the path toward the euro for September 20, 1992. Polls showed the vote was dangerously close. The implications were enormous. A French no vote would collapse the entire project. The uncertainty introduced a fixed deadline into the system, a ticking clock. to speculators. This was an invitation. Hedge funds, like those run by George Soros, examined the numbers and saw a contradiction that could not last. Britain was destroying its own economy to defend a currency peg that served foreign interests. Germany was unwilling to sacrifice its inflation policy. France was prioritizing politics over economics. The system depended on perfect coordination, and it did not exist. In the days leading up to the referendum, rumors spread. Echoes of 1967 returned. There were whispers that the Bundesbank believed the pound was overvalued. That realignment was inevitable. That support was conditional, not guaranteed. On September 16, 1992, the tension snapped. That day became known as Black Wednesday. The British government spent billions of pounds buying sterling in a desperate attempt to hold the line. Interest rates were raised from 10% to 12%, then in a panic to 15%. None of it worked. The markets sold faster than the Bank of England could buy. The smell of desperation was unmistakable. And beneath it all was a deeper truth the markets understood. Britain was trapped inside a system designed to stabilize France and Germany, not Britain. The EUR effectively exported German monetary credibility to France. Britain, stuck on the periphery, paid the price. By the end of the day, the government surrendered. Britain exited the ERM. The pound collapsed. The estimated cost to the British taxpayer exceeded £3 billion. It was more than a financial loss. It was the final destruction of the illusion that Britain could operate as a global monetary power inside a European framework built around others' priorities. The sterling trap had closed for the third and final time. When you step back from the details, the dates, the personalities, the technical language of central banking, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. In 1931, 1967, and 1992, the same drama played out with different actors and different instruments, but with the same underlying structure. Each crisis began with a structurally weakened British economy. In every case, Britain was clinging to a valuation of the pound that reflected prestige rather than productivity. The currency was treated as a symbol of status, something to be defended at almost any cost. But weakness alone does not cause collapse. Plenty of nations survive with overvalued currencies for years. A true breakdown requires pressure at exactly the wrong moment. It requires a catalyst. And in each of these three moments, French policy provided that catalyst. In the 1920s, the weapon was gold. France's decision to hoard and sterilize gold drained liquidity from London and tightened the noose around the pound until Britain could no longer breathe. In the 1960s, the weapon was confidence. Through public gold conversions, symbolic naval missions, and carefully timed leaks to the press, France undermined belief in sterling at the precise moment Britain was most vulnerable. And in the early 1990s, the weapon was institutional rigidity. France's political commitment to European integration and its refusal to allow early adjustment transformed the ERM into a pressure cooker that detonated on Black Wednesday. This does not mean that France caused Britain's decline in some simplistic sense. History is rarely that clean. What it reveals instead is something more subtle and more unsettling. This was not a conspiracy of villains plotting in dark rooms. It was a long-running clash of national interests, fought with the tools available in each era. For centuries, France had lived in the shadow of British financial power. The City of London dominated global trade, credit, and insurance. British money underwrote empires. When France gained leverage through gold accumulation, post-war recovery, or European institutions, it used that leverage to rebalance the system. Not with cannons, but with currencies. This is one of the great lessons of the modern world. You no longer need to blockade a port to destroy a rival's power. You only need to break their bank. The consequences of these financial defeats were profound. The collapse of sterling in 1931 marked the end of the first era of globalization and deepened the Great Depression. The devaluation of 1967 symbolized Britain's loss of global superpower status and accelerated its retreat from east of Suez, and the humiliation of 1992 left a deep psychological scar. It shattered trust in European monetary systems and embedded a lasting sense that Britain's economy had been sacrificed to continental political goals. That memory did not fade. It resurfaced decades later during the debates over sovereignty, borders, and control. When Britain voted to leave the European Union in 2016, many observers were stunned. They should not have been. If you trace the history of the pound, if you follow the echoes of Black Wednesday, the resentment toward fixed exchange rates, and the fear of being trapped in systems designed by others, the result looks far less surprising. The story of Brexit did not begin in 2016. It began in the vaults of central banks. So the next time you hear the decline of the British pound described as a tragic but inevitable story of mismanagement and decay, remember what was happening behind the scenes. Remember the gold bars stacked in the vaults of the Bank of France. Remember the whispers in the corridors of the Élysée Palace. Remember the moments when confidence was deliberately withdrawn at the worst possible time. The Bank of England did not simply fall. It was pushed. And time and again, the hand that applied the pressure spoke French. This perspective changes how we see the 20th century. It shifts our focus away from parliaments and battlefields and toward the silent, grinding mechanics of money. Because economics is not a neutral science, 'tis a weapon. And for the British Empire, it was the weapon that delivered the fatal blow, one bank transfer at a time.